this, as the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about.
And other things.
All right, so I am here tonight with Robert Allen Bartlett, chemist, alchemist, teacher, and author of Real Alchemy, The Way of the Crucible, The Temper of Herbs, and his latest and greatest, the Book of Antimony. Robert, this is an honor to have this opportunity to talk with you, as you're definitely like a torch bearer in the alchemical community. So thank you for joining me tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So you actually studied directly under Frater Albertus for about 10 years, from what I understand. Is that correct? Could you talk a little bit about that experience, and like what was he like as a person as well?
Well, I signed up for the Prima class, which was the first of 7 2-week-long courses with the PRS, the Paracelsus Research Society in Salt Lake. And at the time, he was only accepting like 12 people. You know, it was based on your birth chart largely. You'd send in your birth data and he would select people for the class. And in class, you know, you're in there for 2 weeks from about 9 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon, teaching, situation, lecture, laboratory work going on pretty much continuous from day one. And you're cloistered in there with 12 like-minded souls, nobody goes out for, there's no TVs, no radios, nothing like that, newspapers. You're pretty much centered on doing the work, and there's a library there, and everybody's pretty much intensely focused on doing the work, and for 2 weeks long, so it's a long deal. Frater Albertus had a very dynamic way of teaching. I mean, he had a real presence, he could scare the hell out of you or make everything click together, He was a very powerful man. Later, after several courses, I went back to school at his suggestion. I started a degree in chemistry at San Jose State in California, and later, after taking the courses, I moved to Idaho, up in the primitive area of Idaho, and Frater Albertus directed me to go back to college and finish my degree in chemistry because I would have work to do at Paralab, which was going to be the commercial offshoot of the school. So I worked directly with Frater there after graduation. That was the best suggestion ever, going back to school and finishing my degree. I'm glad I did that. And then I worked directly with Frater, developing mineral and metallic medicines, especially the line of antimony products and the mineral salts in solution. I directly worked with him, or at least had association with him for about 10 years, from 1974 to 1984 when he died.
Oh. I'm glad that you ended up taking that advice from him, because it's really cool. I mean, you have a really unique and awesome insight, because essentially by virtue of your chemistry work, you've been able to access some pretty high-tech analytical lab equipment with like the ability to measure things like thermogravimetric, whatever, like weight loss by heat or whatever, And so I think it could probably be a bit of a mental workout in the sense like being able to bounce between the alchemical mindset and then the more modern chemistry based mindset. I think your ability to do so has definitely allowed you to really bridge some gaps between like the worlds and validate some of the old ways of understanding with, you get your recent book, like the Temper of Herbs. I'm aware that a part of what you're doing was kind of sifting through and like auditing old works and systems that had assigned degrees of temperaments to specific herbs, and you were able to kind of like dial in how they had arrived at that kind of general degree system and then validate through modern chemistry some of those claims and like discern the truth about, about ones that may have had conflicting historical data, and then kind of going above and beyond and building on that foundation. So I definitely commend you for that. Maybe you could briefly describe a bit about like that, how the degrees are assigned in that sense.
Yeah, thanks. I have had to balance the two paradigms, alchemy and modern chemistry, because they are different, although they are from the same root. And so I've had to balance the two situations. The herbs, the thing you're asking about, in the past, medicines were classified as being heating or cooling or drying or moistening to the body. And so if you, for example, got out of balance and you became too dry, then suddenly you're getting skin irritations, dry skin, dry mouth. You have too much dryness in the body. So they would use medicines which were rated as being wet, moistening to the body. And so you would take an herb or a treatment which would add the moisture that you're missing. But you wouldn't want to go too far, make it too much wet, because then you've overshot the mark and now you're getting moisture related illnesses, because you've gone too far. And so they would rate medicines by degrees. There were 4 degrees according to Galen. And later on, under the Arabic influence, they added 7 sub-degrees or subdivisions between each of the degrees. So you can have a degree between the first and second degree. There are 7 subdivisions. Between the second and third degree, 7 subdivisions. So you end up with 28 subdivisions, so the 4 elements. So you could hit the mark much more accurately. But the way they would assign the medicines is they would take a person who they considered to be pretty much equal temperament, not too hot or cold, wet or dry, and then they would give him doses of the medicine and see how it affected him. There was never an empirical way of doing it. They couldn't throw it in the lab and say, yeah, this is hot in the second degree and dry in the first degree. They had to give it to a patient and assess that. And so there were discrepancies even in the literature between, was it hot in the second degree or third degree? So little nuances like that. In the Temper of Herbs, the idea came to me when I was reading Avicenna's work, The Canon of Medicine. He was talking about the melancholic humor, and at one point he calls it like a calx or an ash in the blood. And to an alchemist, that just brings up a whole new picture, because when you're distilling materials, alchemists often speak about the phlegm that comes over. That's the water in various types of distillations. They call the phlegm water or the flood waters. And so suddenly we add this idea of the calx being the melancholic humor. So we had the phlegm, the melancholic humor, and I wondered if plants could be divided. According to the alchemist, you could divide plants into their 4 elements by a distillation process. And so I wondered if taking a plant and doing this division, according to the alchemist, dividing its 4 elements out and weighing those up, if I would come up with the same values that the ancients had assigned to these plants being hot or cold, wet and dry. And initially, I used thermogravimetric analysis. It would measure weight changes as I heated a material up. So I could go from room temperature up to 800 degrees C, and it would show me the weight losses all along the way, very accurately, down to a tenth of a milligram weight loss. But it ran into some problems with gases that are evolved, things that the alchemists wouldn't have been able to weigh and measure. So I had to go to the old school way of actually distilling the plants. And the numbers started coming out like they should. Cold plants came out cold, dry, and wet plants. They all came out like they're supposed to. Little discrepancies, but I think phase 2, I've got some better equipment, better scale, and better ideas on how to do the separation. So I think I can tweak it in and dial it in so it becomes a viable method to assign a plant as being hot in whatever degree, or cold or dry and wet in whatever degree. It's coming out fairly decent, actually. I'm surprised.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's amazing. I'm glad that you're out there doing all that. And so I recently learned about what's called the Archaic of Water from Phoenix Aurelius, and it kind of blew me away. And I'm just fascinated by the possibilities. And I believe I came across this in your Real Alchemy book as well. So I thought it'd be kind of a fun subject to talk about with you. From my limited understanding, you do like a fractional elemental distillation of like rainwater, and then further distill each of the 4 elements into their 3 divisions. And then in combining different combinations of these 12 distillations in particular ratios,
That's
and then
right.
like
Yeah.
you can combine them with the gur and kind of like generate various life forms and mineral and vegetable. And so I'm just wondering if you may
Yeah.
be able to like elaborate on some of the general formulas or combinations, if you want to, like say if you wanted to create mineral life, for example, like what pattern or formula of distillations would you use, and then combine something like that?
Well, the idea originally comes from a work called The Golden Chain of Homer. It was written around 1723, and it's really kind of a primer on alchemy. And he discusses a work in which you use water, just rainwater, as being a universal medium. It's nature's universal paintbrush in a way. You collect rainwater under certain conditions. It shouldn't touch the ground, it shouldn't touch metal or animals or anything like that. So you collect rainwater, and if it's during a thunderstorm, all the better, because you want all that fixed nitrogen in the water. Then you'll set the water out in a pot, just covered lightly, to keep dust and bugs and things out, and it will ferment. You wouldn't think water would ferment, but you'll set it out there, and in a month or 2, it'll turn slimy and maybe even start to smell kind of funky. You feel the inside wall of the pot and it feels slimy. So you take that and you stir it all up really good, and you pour that off into a flask, and you'll see this kind of a fibrous material. They call it the gur. It's a universal seed, according to the Golden Chain of Homer. It's like nature's stem cell. You can make it become anything. It's a universal seed. So we collect that kind of fibrous thing, and once you dry it, very gently dry it, you'll see it. You don't get very much. So you got to start with a large quantity, or keep collecting over a period. Sometimes it will look like somebody dropped a ball of cotton in the water, and you'll see this ball of white fibrous matter floating around in the water. That's the gur, and you would collect that and dry it very gently. The water now that's been fermented, you pour that into a distillation train, and you you distill it in certain ways. According to the Golden Chain of Homer, it's a more complicated process, but a lot of the modern offshoots from the method just take the water and start distilling it fractionally and collecting the first 12th, then the next 12th part, you divide it into 12. So you take your volume that you're beginning, divide that by 12, and then you'll collect each of those fractions till you get down to the final fraction, which you just collect that as is. And each of those fractions can be assigned to an element and one of the three essentials. So ideally, what you would do is take your water and distill it into 4 fractions. So say you have a liter of water and you distill off the first quarter and you label that as the fire. That's the most volatile part. You continue distilling, and the next part that comes out is the air, and you label that quarter of a liter as being the air element. Now you keep distilling and you'll come up with the water element, and you'll label that as the water element, and then what remains will be your earth element. So you have now these 4 fractions of water separated out, and they'll look like distilled water. The first time I did this years ago, I was living in Idaho, and I had done this separation into the 4 elements, and I set them on my lab table, and I had to leave for a few days to get some supplies. And this is way up in the mountains. So while I was gone, it froze, the fire went out, and when I got back, I mean, it was like minus 20 up there in the cabin. So I was concerned about the damage in the lab. I go into the lab, and there the fire of water was still liquid and took on a golden color. The air of fire had totally blown up the glass, and it was white. And if you looked closely at it, it was white because it was filled with bubbles, tiny little bubbles. That was the air element.
Wow.
Next to that was the water element, still totally liquid. It's minus 20 in the room there. You can see your breath practically crystallizing as you're breathing out, and then next to that was the earth element, which had frozen solid, but didn't break the glass. It turned into a clear, totally frozen solid. And so same water, they all looked like water, but they had totally different effects at minus 20, just sitting out. So they do have their differences, and I've measured some of them with some thermal equipment. I was able to measure some of the differences in their different fractions. Each one they have characteristics that set them apart as a different thing. So once you have your 4 fractions, the 4 elements, you additionally distill those into 3. The first part that comes out will be the sulfur principle, and then the mercury principle, and then the salt principle will be what remains. So you take your fire element, you distill out, and now you have the sulfur of fire of water. And then you keep distilling, you have now your mercury of fire of water. And you end up with your salt of fire of water. You do that with each of the 4 elements, and you end up with 12 fractions. So you have salt, sulfur, and mercury of each of the 4 elements. And depending on how you combine those, you can create what they call an archaeus. And an archaeus is kind of like, archae means something very old. And the archaeus was considered to be like the ancient prime mover of something, the ancient architect and designer of whatever it is you're going to make. So if you take equal portions of each of your 12 and you combine those and you let them circulate, reflux for a while, that becomes a very powerful medicine called the universal archaeus. It is like water that has been super purified and elevated, spiritualized. Um, to grow things, there's a whole series of experiments where you take that dry gur. Remember, we saved that gur out in the beginning. We put that into a flask, and now we create a special archaeus. If we want to grow, say, animal life, we put in more of the more volatile elements, more of the air and fiery elements. We have to have all four elements present, but we make it dominate with fire and air element, because animal life is very volatile. It's totally separated from the earth. You know, it can fly around and jump around. So animal works generate very volatile materials. Animal life has a lot of volatiles, volatile salts, volatile oils, mercuries. Plants, they're also volatile, but not quite so volatile as animal life. They're still attached to the ground, you know, but they're somewhat detached, out flowing around in the ground. The mineral life is very dense and still attached to the ground, certainly. So we have this whole ladder of volatility and fixity, as the golden chain explains it. So if we want to generate animal life, we have our archaeus dominate more in the air and fire elements. If we want to generate plant life, then we add the water and air elements, have those predominate. But remember, we still have to have all four elements present. For mineral life, we'll let the earth and water elements predominate. And if you get the proportions just right and you saturate your gur and let it digest over a period of time, it will become gritty, and you'll feel grains of minerals start growing. And if you have the proportions just right, it said you can even grow gold and silver this way. If you have major archaeus with, say, more water and air elements present, along with some fire and earth, of course, you'll generate plant life. And pretty soon you'll see like little green, looks like mold or algae growing at the bottom. And you take that and you do what they call a philosophic calcination, where it's more like a succussion, like they do in homeopathic preparations. You pound it such that it bursts the thing apart, and you pound it like 100 times on something hard, and it's called a philosophic calcination. Now, next time it reforms, and you're feeding it this archaeus that you've made, the next time it reforms, it will become more complicated, a much more evolved plant. And then you do that succussion again, it will blow it all apart. And when it reforms, it will become even more concentrated or more complicated, all the way up to where you've seen little trees growing in flasks and things. Same
Wow,
with animals.
that just absolutely amazes me. Like, that's unbelievable. And so I think you had mentioned a similar sort of process in your book, Real Alchemy, mentioning using a 4x3 fractional distillation to obtain like the 12 fractions, but I think it was a concentrated vinegar of antimony being used to extract the oil of gold. And then I think he went on to describe the process and how it's like very powerful as a menstruum to like extract the essentials from their mineral realm. So it had me kind of like wondering about like alchemy, or I mean antimony consumption. And I've heard like historically, you know, that antimony was often used as like a purgative. And I'm wondering, with this in mind, if one were to ingest this, how does antimony interact with someone biologically, like as it acts on them? Like, would it deplete them of, say, like native mineral functionality, or, you know, something like iron levels or zinc levels or whatever trace minerals they might have in their body natively in the purgative process? Or would it carry some of these trace minerals out, or does it quite work like that, or is it a little different?
Yeah, the tincture of antimony, Actually, done right, it doesn't have any antimony in it. It's an oil catalytically prepared by the antimony from a menstruum. It takes a prepared menstruum, a solvent, and its activity on it is more like a catalyst that creates the oil of antimony in a very characteristic way. So it's specific for the antimony. In the end, you end up with an oil. One is fixed and one is unfixed, depending on how you do the extraction. And these will be blood red oils that have very characteristic properties and concentrations of various materials. The amount of antimony and arsenic to some degree, most antimony ores contain at least a small amount of arsenic, which will also carry through the process, but the amounts are in the parts per billion level. Tinctures I've measured at most maybe 30 parts per billion arsenic and antimony. And at the usage level of being only 1 or 2 drops, the effective dose of antimony or arsenic is really nil at that point. It's probably more therapeutic than anything else. But it's true, antimony was used for its toxic properties for centuries. That's why they still use it today, because it will induce vomiting and evacuation of bowels in various ways. Prepared as the tincture, it still will evacuate, but not so violently. The unfixed tincture tends to evacuate poisons through the normal channels like stool and urine. It's more tonic and warming to the body. The fixed tincture, prepared to a process using vinegar, it's more cooling and contracting, and it eliminates wastes and toxins through perspiration. And so you may wake up in the middle of the night after taking a dose of fixed antimony just drenched in sweat, but it will feel right. And you'll see that whatever was ailing you is now gone, just that fast. Antimony tinctures are amazing.
You actually worked in an antimony mine too, is that correct?
Yeah.
Oh,
That's one of those cases of synchronicity. I got back from the Secunda class at the PRS was all about antimony, 2 weeks of antimony work. And I had a small amount of antimony in my lab already, and not enough to do much with, but it wasn't probably, I don't know, it was less than a month after class that I got home and was approached by someone asking me if I wanted a job. And I asked him what it was, and it was mining stibnite, the ore of antimony, just 16 miles downriver from where I was living. So I ended up mining for a couple of seasons underground to get my own antimony. Quite an experience.
That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, antimony has a wild history. I've heard of like what was dubbed the antimony war, kind of between like the Galenic lines of thinking and the alchemical line. They kind of criticize antimony as being like non-effective humorally, I guess. And what would you say to that notion of antimony being humorally non-effective? Is that
actually antimony was banned. Yeah, if it's prepared the right way, antimony is a powerful medicine, but if it's not, it's still a very powerful poison, and that's what got antimony into trouble. It was banned from medicine for like 100 years. Doctors had to sign a little thing that said that they wouldn't use antimony compounds in their practice. It wasn't until some dignitary got cured, last ditch effort to cure this. I forget who it was, high up. I don't know if he was a king or a prince, but he was deathly ill and nothing was working, and a shot of antimony cured him. And so they allowed use of antimony again in medicine. But it was banned for almost 100 years, even though people were still working on it and exploring antimony. But antimony's been around with us since the Egyptians. They used it quite a bit themselves.
And Kabbalistically, antimony corresponds to the Sephirot of Malkuth. Can you talk a little bit about the nature of that particular emanation or Sephirot and how that may kind of speak to the nature of like the consciousness aspects of antimony?
That gets into why antimony is so interesting in alchemy. Antimony is said to be immortal. You can't kill antimony like you can other metals. Like if I go out and I gather some copper ore and I smelt it out, I end up with copper metal, which is the body, the corpse of copper. The volatiles, the intelligence and the spirit have gone up the chimney, during the smelting process. And they go up to the realm of copper, to Netzach, on the tree of life, and that energy gets recycled and comes back again in another form. With antimony, you try to kill antimony and you can't. It has nowhere to go but here. So when you smelt antimony, the ghost may depart shortly, but it comes back in. It has nowhere to go but here. And so they actually utilize that property to enliven gold. The Philosopher's Stone is said to be gold exalted to its utmost degree, taken beyond what nature can do. And that's where the art steps in, is that you see gold has used up all its energy to become perfect. Like a plant, it's grown up and it's made its seed and it's done its job, and now it's pooped. It can't go any further. It's done its job. It's made seed. We're golden now. Gold, same way. It's become gold. It's perfect. It's incorruptible, but it can't take another step. It's used up all its energy. But we come in now with antimony and infuse it with new life and make gold, push it gold beyond where nature has left it, push it one more step further, and it becomes now a very powerful stone, the Philosopher's Stone. So there are ways of using antimony and infusing the life of antimony into gold such that gold becomes more exalted than nature can produce. So antimony is also called the Aries of the philosophers. Aries is the sign where the sun is exalted. So antimony has been used for centuries to purify gold. It's a very powerful way to purify gold, using antimony and gold as an alloy.
That's fascinating.
So antimony has an amazing history and use in alchemical works.
And you had briefly mentioned that you said the seed of gold or the seed of metals. I want to talk about the seed of metals. Like generally we hear of like the seeds of plants or, but in the mineral realm, not so much at all. And to quote your book, you said minerals are alive. They grow, evolve, produce seed, and die just like plants and animals. But they do this at an imperceptibly slow rate. So what stands out most to me about the seed aspect, so I was hoping to talk a little bit about like the mineral or metallic seeds and how they're kind of like identified, or how are they created, just like any interesting details to shed light on it, and like maybe as like a complementary angle we can tie it in with antimony, because I kind of like you just mentioned, I think antimony as a spagyric is what is referred to as what can be used to generate, like you said, this Well, I don't know if you had mentioned, but the stone of fire or the firestone. Um, and I
Yeah.
don't know if this is synonymous with the regulus of antimony, or is that a little different? But maybe we can talk a little bit about that and like what the connection is between that and then like the seed of gold, and kind of help me make sense of all of that, because it's a little bit confusing for me. But
Well, it is said that you can obtain the seed of gold in the scoria of antimony. When you smelt antimony, there's a certain amount of slag material. Slag is kind of a glassy um, flux material that comes out, and the metal separates from that. And the seed of gold is said to be hidden within that slag. And if you capture that, you can actually grow it into metallic gold, just like you would grow a seed crop of a plant. You have to feed it the right materials, and there are a number of processes where workers would take minerals and materials that gold was found associated with. Say, you find gold associated with quartz veins, and there's arsenic involved and pyrite. So we get all these things together, and they are like the raw materials that go to make up the gold. These things are like the potting soil, in a sense, that the gold grows up in. So we get together quartz and vitriol and pyrite and some arsenic and mix that all together as our mulch, and then we seed it with something that we've derived from gold, and we digest it, maybe under hot temperatures. We maybe have to keep it warm at 500 degrees for a month or two. And then we pull it out and we analyze it, and we find out that we just grew like 4 or 5 grams of gold from practically nothing. Things that could become viable as methods to generate gold from minerals or other metals. It was believed that metals grew under the ground, and it was very common practice in Europe to close a mine for a generation so that the mineral could regrow, and then they would come back maybe 1 or 2 generations and rework that mine, and they would find new ore available. So the idea is that minerals grow underground. It goes way back in mining history. A lot of ideas about how to go about growing your own metals from the seeds of gold or of each of the metals. Something I was looking into myself, actually growing the metal oils. There was a process similar to this using for plants. There was a doctor, Mary Lynn. She wrote a book called A Galaxy of Scents, scent like odors. I met her in Salt Lake during my pre-med class. Somebody knew her, and we paid her a visit. She was growing her own essential oils. She would take parts of a plant and mix those with a digestive enzyme. And this was, I found out years later that this was just a regular over-the-counter digestive mix of enzymes like, papyrus enzymes, lipase, and various enzymes you can buy for over-the-counter digestion aids. She would mix some of that with her powdered up plant material, say, rosemary. Mix a little rosemary with that powder, and then drop on liquid from a night blooming plant. And it had to be like 7 or 49 drops. You drop it on, and she would close this container and let it digest. just at room temperature, and it would grow the oil. She would tap that oil off 7 times from the same bottle, and the oil smelled heavenly. Each one of them. I have some still that it's over 40 years old, and it still smells like, wow, it's like a
Oh my
heavenly
gosh.
field.
That's incredible.
So I was thinking of applying a similar idea with the metallic oils, finding similar enzymes in the metallic realm, like antimony or vitriol, some of the other salts, even exploring the idea of using lichens as materials which can digest rocks, or at least open them up. So possibilities still exist for a lot of interesting work in alchemy in that direction,
Wow.
growing your own oils.
That's amazing. So what is tartar exact? How does tartar tie into all this? And like how would, yeah, can you elaborate a little bit on like tartar?
Tartar is, when they brew wine, they put it in barrels, and as it ages, you get this crust forming on the inside of the barrel. It's crystalline. It's mostly potassium bitartrate and tartaric acid, and some of the grape skins and solids get grown in there, but it's basically crystal growth inside the wine barrel, and they come and scrape that out, and spice companies come and purchase it, and they take it and they crush it up and boil it in water, filter it, and evaporate it down, and then you have cream of tartar. So when you buy cream of tartar, that's where it came from, these wine barrels. And I found you can substitute cream of tartar for crude tartar in most cases for alchemical works.
Are there a bunch of different types of tartar? Like, is it the oak barrel? Like, does the oak have some kind of effect that helps instigate the growth of the tartar? Or would it matter if you used like a different material for the vessel?
Not that much. It's more the grapes. There's red tartar from red wine grapes, and there's white tartar from white wine grapes. And those are the main differences. The barrels, if anything, maybe some slight differences, I would think. Not too sweeping, not as much as the actual grapes themselves, the source. Some grapes will have much more tartar in them, much more bitter type of grapes. So I think it would depend more on the country and the type of grapes and the actual wine barrel. But tartar has a lot of uses in alchemy, because we take that and we can calcine it, and we come up with a salt of tartar, which is potassium carbonate. And potassium carbonate can be used to fuse practically any mineral and get it into a soluble form. So it's a way to open up the mineral realm. It's also very deliquescent. So if I take my potassium carbonate and I spread it out in a dish and leave it exposed to the moist night air, it will liquefy. It will suck moisture right out of the air and become liquid. And we can use that liquid now as a solvent, a new type of menstruum, where we can put a plant into that liquid and it will open it up and do an extraction for us. And then on top of that liquid, we pour some alcohol, and the alcohol and the salt of tartar, they won't mix. And so you'll have two liquids floating on each other. And the alcohol will take up the tincture that the salt of tartar released, and the tincture will go up now into the alcohol layer, and you pull the alcohol layer off, and you have what they call an ENS tincture, which is a very powerful way to extract plants, because the caustic nature of that potassium carbonate liquid, it basically tears the plant cells apart and releases all the essentials from inside the cell. So everything leaks out and you can get a much deeper extraction. And then the alcohol will float on the liquid, so it's an easy separation of the two. So it's an interesting process. It's also, salt of tartar is used also to dry alcohol. You know, when you distill alcohol, you can only get it up to 96%. That's why you can only buy Everclear at 96%, because that's the best they can do distilling it. If you want to get 100% alcohol, you can take your 96% Everclear and add the dry salt of tartar to it, say about an ounce, you know, or two to every liter, and shake it up really good. And that salt of tartar has a ravenous appetite for water, so it will suck all the moisture out of the alcohol and drop to the bottom. You take your alcohol now and distill it one more time or two times, and you'll have 100% alcohol. It gets you past this little point called the azeotrope. At 96% alcohol, it forms a constant boiling mixture with water, which you can't separate by distillation. But using the salt of tartar dries it up just enough where now you can do one more distillation and get it up to 100% alcohol. So it's a handy trick, especially for mineral works, not so much for plant works, but for mineral works, you want to have an absolutely dry alcohol in many cases. So this is a way of drying your alcohol to get it 100%.
Wow. I want to kind of bounce back to antimony for a minute. I think there's a guy you mentioned, Kirk Ring of Holland, I think, and I think he had mentioned like some anti-cancer. He made some anti-cancer discoveries or something. Could you elaborate, touch on that a little bit?
Dr. Kirkring, he did a translation of Basil Valentine's Triumphal Chariot of Antimony, and he used antimony in his practice and notes curing cancer and other problems. He gives a lot of hints and tips. He talks about making a menstruum using alcohol and sublimated sal ammoniac, ammonium chloride, to make a special menstruum which will extract antimony glass. So you get that tincture, an unfixed tincture, using the Kirkring menstruum. Basil Valentine talks about, you know, curing cancer and such, and that's when antimony got into trouble because everyone wanted to try this out, you know, and then people were making it wrong, and a lot of people started dying, which made them ban the use of antimony. So, you know, you have to have a special knowledge to understand how to make it correctly, I guess. Otherwise, you end up with poison, you know. It is a violent poison, but I've used antimony for years, given it to animals, given it to all kinds of things. I think it's an amazing material. I've seen it cure things overnight.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it definitely is amazing. I mean, it's just interesting reading about it. Like, could be used to strengthen, protect against like the corrosion of lead. It expands as it solidifies, I guess, rather than contracts. I don't know, just a lot of interesting stuff. Are there any other kind of strange properties that you think might be interesting to share about antimony?
Antimony? Antimony is very interesting. It's a glass former, so you can make glass, which is, you can get practically any color of glass by how you treat the antimony. Generally, though, you'll get yellows and deep reds very easily from antimony. I mean, these are like cathedral type deep red glass, stained glass, really awesome colors out of antimony. In fact, some of the tinctures, Robert Boyle, alchemist in the 1600s, he says it has a color to delight. And it is, it has this really beautiful scarlet red color, a lot of its products. So I like antimony.
Definitely. So this next question is kind of like a two-part question. So in the Sacred Cycles section of your book, you discussed nature's principles of vibration and rhythm in relation to like early observations of the stars and awaiting specific time windows in order to capture the momentum of subtle forces in accordance with nature's laws. And you ended the paragraph with the following. You said, there are many such connections between gardening and alchemical works. So the first question, I was wondering if you could maybe give some examples of this in your opinion. What are some of these connections? And then two is, have you ever applied any sort of alchemical philosophy or process to your garden yourself?
Yeah. Each of the plants, are associated with different planetary energies. They're said to vibrate, in resonance with certain things. And so how you lay out the garden, when you plant things or when you harvest things, I've looked at some of those, some of the differences when you harvest a material. Does it make a difference? Even exposure to different planetary energies. For example, I had, the big dish antennas they used to have, the huge ones, 8-foot diameter things. Looks like you could contact Neptune,
Yeah.
or you're part of the SETI group, we had one of those here on site, and I took a bunch of the old CDs back when AOL was sending out CDs every week. You'd get a pile of AOL CDs in your mailbox. I collected a bunch of those, and I put about 30 up on this dish antenna, and I replaced the receiver on it with a big globe, like a fish globe. And I put rainwater inside the globe, and the same rainwater I put down at the base, another beaker. So I had 2 beakers of water, one sitting at the base of this big dish antenna, and the other in a globe where all these CDs were focusing the moonlight onto the globe. So I followed the moonlight all one night with this big antenna, focusing the light onto the water inside the globe. And in the morning, I took it to work and I ran it on this instrument they call a ion chromatograph. And it would tell you things like how much chloride is there and how much nitrate and phosphate. Anyway, the nitrate concentration, like in the rainwater that was just sitting at the base, I had this little tiny hump of maybe, half a part billion of nitrate. And then for the rainwater that got exposed, it had this huge peak. I mean, it was up to like 7 parts per million, which was significant difference from where it was just by exposure to moonlight. Nothing else. I mean, it was the same water. So things do have an influence on, at a planetary level. We use the moonlight a lot, in our gem elixirs. So it's very often, you get gem elixirs. It's popular to take a gemstone and you put it into a water alcohol mixture and expose it to the moonlight, and then drink the water later. We take the gemstone and mix it with an equal amount of an equal weight of the oil of silver. Silver being the perfect mirror for anything. So we mix the stone and the silver together and then expose it to moonlight through a very powerful lens. I have a big Fresnel lens. It's about 3 feet by 2.5 feet Fresnel lens, which if you focus sunlight on it, it will melt granite. It gets that hot. So we used it to focus moonlight directly into this oil of silver and the stone for several times. And then we do homeopathic dilutions from that, exposing it in each phase to the moon, concentrated through this mirror. So there are ways to take advantage of, planetary happenings, and the connections with gardening. You see how things come up. They have everything has their own season, and so you'll see these things happening in the garden. So it's an important or a good training thing for nature to have a little garden and see what kind of changes take place. Because these kinds of changes happen on different levels to different things. Even the mineral realms has their periods of growth and rest and seeding and falling apart, that kind of thing. So they all have their seasons of winter, summer, and back again.
I'm glad I asked. That was some advanced alchemical techniques right there. So I wanted to talk to you about the nature of the spirit and kind of your understanding of its relationship with the soul, but more so like an emphasis on the role of the spirit. I've heard, like, because it's kind of my understanding, like the soul as the psyche or mind, like that, and then like the spirit being like the wisdom or kind of that inner intuitive voice. Or I'm kind of just curious your understanding and how you make sense of the soul and the relationship with the spirit, but kind of more so focused on the aspects of the spirit.
Yeah, you're not alone there, because people have been confusing spirit and soul for centuries, and even among experts, there's differences of opinion. The soul portion in alchemy generally represents that part of the intelligence that makes you uniquely you. In Egyptian mysticism, they had the Ka and the Ba. And so the Ba it's that human-headed bird image that floats around above the mummy you see in hieroglyphic images. The Ba was the person's personality, his character, everything that made him uniquely him. The Ka is the other portion of the man's subtle body, and that is the life force, the spirit, and it was more like the divine intelligence in a way. You see, the Mercury and spirit, they're designated the same, and Mercury is, the symbol of Mercury is the intelligence. Well, I'm getting a halo here. Maybe I'll sit here and my halo is showing, huh?
Yep, it's coming through.
So the Mercury has that same glyph, of, the intelligence. Mercury is indicating the intelligence of things. When you do a chart reading, you look for Mercury to understand their nature of communication, their intelligence in a sense. But it goes back to Mercury, to Thoth, to Hermes, Hermetics. That's all tied in. So spirit, in Egyptian mysticism, then would be the Ka, and the Ka and the Ba work together. They could take on autonomous existence. So the Ba could take on its own existence and kind of drift off after someone died and kind of dissolve off in the netherworld. Same with the Ka. The Ka could take on an autonomous existence and carry on for a while, but eventually would dissipate. There was a way the Egyptians, if you were rich enough and you could afford it, you could have priests who would attend to your Ka and your Ba. And what would happen is that on your death, the priest would be hired to basically retain your Ka and your Ba in the astral world, and they would purify them and put them back together into what was now called an Ach. And an Ach was a glorified being, an enlightened person. So when you put the Ka and the Ba back together, basically you're reuniting the sulfur and the mercury. It sounds very alchemical, and so you can readily see why alchemy is, Egypt is the birthplace of alchemy. Their whole mystical process is very alchemical. Anyway, we've got the Ba and the Ka, which are the sulfur and the mercury, and these become purified through ritual and chanting and various processes in the temples, reunited as the Ach. And now the Ach would be able to re-enter the body, which was the salt. And so they preserved the body, the mummy, to act as the third essential. Now the Ach, the glorified being, could make its presence known by entering the body, the mummy, and it could make its desires or thoughts known to those around it, and it could come and go between the worlds through this focal point, the mummy. So the ideas of the Ka and the Ba directly mirror the spirit and sulfur aspects in alchemy, as being vehicles for the intelligence. It could be the lower intelligence and the spiritual higher intelligence. So there are grades and gradations.
Yeah, I
But
think
in
I've heard
alchemy,
of. Oh, go ahead.
but in alchemy, we see also that we can subtly divide spirit and sulfur. So we can get a fixed sulfur, and we can get a volatile sulfur. We can also get a salt of sulfur. So we get basically a body, soul, and spirit of sulfur. Same we can do with mercury. We can get a body, soul, and spirit of mercury or of the salt itself. So it's in a fractal sense, the principles keep going on, body, soul, and spirit, even at that subtle level.
Yeah, that's interesting. You talked about the Ka and the Ba. I've heard this term Merkabah. I think it might have been associated with like something like the divine light body or something like that. I don't know if you're familiar.
Yeah, it's a different idea, but the word comes basically from that.
Yeah. And then what about the Atman? Is that like an Egyptian aspect of like the source of purity within us or something? Or
Atman, no, that's Indian philosophy.
okay.
Atman would be related to the Mercury, the Kether in Kabbalistic, or at least the supernal triad.
So you had touched on the Egyptian origins of alchemical wisdom. I haven't gone super deep into like the Egyptian consciousness as much as I would like to, but it's definitely like a constant subject that I keep coming back to pretty often. I'm wondering if you maybe could lend any insights into some information that kind of complements the notion of the alchemical roots in Egypt. We know like the word itself is linked, of course, but I'm wondering like other details that may be interesting. I don't know, like was alchemy in Egypt, was it like a way of life, or was it a specific class of initiates, or what is your kind of understanding of the very root and origins of alchemy in Egypt?
Well, I think it changed quite a bit over time. Alchemy per se wasn't even called alchemy until around maybe the 4th century. Before that, we had the Egyptians had quite a technological advance as far as skill level in technology, especially metallurgy and medicine. In the ancient world, they were famous as being the most powerful healers. And with metals, they could literally paint with metals, make metals any color they want, different textures, ceramics. I mean, we see it in their art, and some of the things they've done, we can't do today. We're still wondering how they did some of the things. Later, around 800 BC, the Greeks started to visit Egypt, and still later they were allowed to go up beyond the Delta region. Initially the Greeks weren't allowed to go up to the higher temples. They had to stay around Memphis area and the Delta. Later on, as they gained the Egyptians gained confidence in them, they were allowed to go further up. So all the philosophers, like Pythagoras, he studied with the Egyptians for like 20 years before he started putting out his stuff. So a lot of the Greek philosophy is derived from Egyptian mysticism. The Greek mind, they like things very organized and ordered. So they took all of this Egyptian mysticism and kind of reworked it to be more digestible to the Greek mind, much more practical oriented. So you could see Egyptian mysticism in Greek philosophy all over the place. Later on, as time went on, the Greeks, well, Egypt was known as Chem, the land Chem. It meant black, and that was in reference to the annual flooding of the Nile brought this nice black, rich soil that Egypt was dependent on for their agriculture. So Chem or Kemet was the land of Egypt, and these arts, as they became known to the Greeks, and the information flooded into Greeks, it was called Chemia, the Egyptian arts, or the black arts. The origin of the term black arts was Chemia, from Chem, and then later, after the collapse of the Roman Empire and things fell apart, all this moved into the Arabic world, and they added the Arabic particle al to the Greek chemia, and it became known as alchemia, and then later Latinized into alchemy. So it goes back that far to the Greeks, and the Greek introduction of or adaptation of Egyptian mysticism into Greek philosophy. It's written all over it. In fact, there are a few texts that talk about that. One, Stolen Legacy was one. I don't know if it was was any good, but there are a number of texts that talk about the connection between Egyptian mystical ideas and Greek philosophy, and how they are basically derivative. The Greek ideas paralleling and mirroring the Egyptian materials, just in a different sense, making it more rational to the Greek mind.
Yeah. There's a book I've been wanting to explore for a while now, called the Egyptian Book of the Dead. You've probably are familiar. It's funny because I guess the Egyptian translation actually is translated as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, or the book emerging forth into the light. I was wondering if you've explored this work, and if so, what your take on it was.
I have. I actually drew my own.
Wow.
Do you want to see it?
Definitely.
I could grab it 1 second.
Okay, yeah.
Let me grab it. I'll show you.
All right. Take your time.
This is Book of the Dead. See it.
Wow, that's beautiful. How long did that take you? It looks pretty elaborate. That's crazy.
It took, I don't know, 6 months.
Wow, I
I
love
wanted
it.
to learn how to read and write hieroglyphics. Do some artworks. I kind of combined it into one project here.
Wow.
Anyway, it's
So beautiful.
So, it's like 30 feet long. Goes on for
Oh my
quite
gosh,
a while.
that's amazing.
It took about 6 months, I guess, 6 to 8 months. A lot of the pigments. I made the pigments out of minerals, just like the Egyptians used mineral pigments, and so I used the same kind of minerals and binding materials like gum arabic and some of the plant resins for the binders of the plant. So
I'm assuming
very
it
much
must.
like
Sorry, I was going to say it must definitely be something of significance to you. You took 6 months to do your own, so that's pretty incredible.
well, yeah. I wanted to, like I say, I wanted to learn how to read and write hieroglyphics and do some artwork at the same time. So I combined the two projects. I have another one which is in English. It's a scroll it's 110 feet long, but it's all Egyptian magic. So I have that scanned in. I want to make it available as a book. So I recently got all of my stuff scanned in. I had a team of 4 people came in from Hawaii and a couple other places, and they spent a week from 8 a.m. till 10 or 11 at night, like scanning in all my notebooks and all my stuff. It took them that long to scan it all in. So I had like 50 years of collected notes, notebooks, and pictures. So now it's all scanned in, and I can start generating books from it.
Yeah,
So-
you have some plans, you're calling it I don't know, I heard you mention, but you're going to be coming out with multiple books basically based off of all your notes. Is that true?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
They'll basically be my scanned in notebooks with commentary and expansion here and there, pictures. So I have scans, instrumental scans and stuff I've collected over 50 years of experiments on things. And so I want to make it all available so that other people can look at it, check it out, and duplicate it. And
I'm glad you're
keep it
doing
going.
that. More the merrier. We don't, keep the texts flowing, and maybe multiple copies of them in case we ever run into some kind of Library of Alexandria type situation.
Yeah, that was worried me because that was the only copy that existed in the world, and if anything happened, it'd be 50 years, down the drain. So I'm glad. I want to get all the information out there. It does no good just sitting on my shelf,
Definitely. So what was your takeaway from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and kind of what is it all about in general?
In general, it's a way of navigating the underworld, subtle planes. It's basically a map for exploring the mind.
So would the underworld be related to like the unconscious in some way, or
Yeah.
Fascinating.
They also have, similar related texts. It's the Journey of the Sun, Book of the Day, and the Book of the Night. The Book of that which is in the netherworld, the Book of Pylons, Book of Gates. They all talk about 12 hours of the night that the sun has to go through this journey, and the sun representing, your consciousness. And it goes through this journey of death and resurrection, basically, and has to go through different types of turmoils and triumphs in the whole process in doing that. And they're all indicative of mental states that come up, living and dead, so it's kind of a interesting psychological perspective, as far as the Egyptians' idea of cosmology.
I'd say. So was there any more that you were going to elaborate on that? I don't want to cut you off. I just wasn't sure if you were finished.
Not really. My real interest is their treatment and use of materials. Being a chemist, alchemist, I always look at their ideas concerning materials, how they used materials and how they classified materials. And Egyptians, they had the most advanced medical system in the ancient world, long before Hippocrates. As far removed from us as Hippocrates is, the Egyptians, physicians, they had books that were very elaborate medical texts that were as far away from Hippocrates as we are from him, Hippocrates. They go back in history 1,600 years before Hippocrates was even born. Elaborate medical texts talking about a materia medica having over 700 different compounds, medicines, treating 800 different illnesses from head to toe. That's the Ebers Papyrus. So my interest is how they use materials, how they treat materials, classify them. And that all ties into alchemy and their use in alchemy, and the concepts between materials and how they're prepared, how they're treated, all ties into the alchemical paradigm as it was at the time. They didn't call it alchemy at that time, but it all led into what we know as alchemy.
Yeah. Well, I want to touch on maybe one more thing with you before we kind of wrap it up. It was in a book that I was reading, and it said God energizes mind, mind energizes the soul or the psyche, soul energizes spirit, and then spirit energizes matter. For you, in your opinion, does that ring true, or is there anything you would add or take away, or what are your thoughts about that?
No, that rings true. Soul and spirit, like I say, they kind of interchange in a certain sense. So matter energized by spirit. Yeah. Some of the earliest definitions of alchemy relate to some kind of change or transformation affected by light, heat, or spirit. Those are original ideas behind alchemy. Some kind of change that was happening, orchestrated by spirit, or they were kind of synonymous: spirit, light, fire. Down here, we're in the realm of the four elements. You know, where they call this the sublunary world because we're below the sphere of the moon, below Yesod on the tree of life. And this is the realm of the four elements. Above us is the stars, the starry realm, and the stars were said to be made of the fifth element, the quintessence. That's why they're unchangeable. Things down here, you know, are always in flux and flow and change, the elements changing one to the other. There in the celestial realm, they're permanent, they're eternal. And the fifth element, the quintessence, is said to be the carrier of intelligence. In fact, Newton described it as being intelligent matter. And this rains down on us all the time. The ancients call it a celestial vapor, and it rains down on us even in the rainwater. That's why we get into that work with the rainwater. That quintessence is loaded in the rainwater. And all of these alchemical preparations we do affect a concentration of that quintessence, that incorruptible substance that the stars are made of, that rains down on everything, collected by plants, and these alchemical preparations concentrate it. And so we end up with this concentrated fifth element, the quintessence, which can carry intelligence. You can impress thoughts into your spagyric, and it will understand it and take it where it needs to go. It sounds strange, I know, but you can tell your teacher and say, you know, I need you to like work on my liver. You know, can you flush out the plug up in there? You know, and it will listen. The fifth essence is like the director. Everything is in your body to cure yourself. It just needs someone to direct it. This stuff will go in and say, you know, you got to go over here, you got to go over there, bring this on, let it flow. And these things can do that. They're looking into director molecules now in medicine. There are things that carry intelligence, and this fifth element is one of them that can be, in a sense, programmed. And that's where more of the spiritual ideas come in, the meditation, the charging of your elixirs, that kind of thing.
Wow. Yeah. Well, Robert, this has definitely been amazing. You're always welcome back anytime. I just want to thank you for all your contributions and all of the many people that you've impacted. So first, if you have any last thoughts or messages that you want to put out, feel free. And then wherever you would like to direct people to find out more about you and your work, just go ahead and let the people know.
Well, I appreciate your interest and everyone's interest, you know, in keeping the subject alive. We do teach classes here on site. In fact, we have one starting tomorrow. We teach 3 levels, prima, secunda, and tertia. So we start off with plants, and we start at the beginning. You don't have to know anything about anything. So don't feel like you have to know anything to start, because we begin at the beginning and slowly gain your skill and confidence level up to where you can work with metallic medicines in tertia. So we are offering classes, and you can get information at our website, spagyricus.com, and see if you can take a class. There's nothing like physical, hands-on class. They're generally 4 days long, and they're intensives. You're here for 4 days with like-minded souls, and they're hands-on, very intense classes. So you can learn more in 4 days than months of reading, So we do have our classes, and we have video products as well. So do check out our site. You want to continue on that?
I actually had one more thing I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah.
What is the image behind the antimony symbol on the cover of your book?
That that is a piece of glass of antimony that we cast out one day, and it came out the shape of a dragon head. And antimony has been called a black dragon because, well, it's black, and if you breathe the fumes, you can die. So if you breathe a dragon's breath, you will die. So antimony is toxic, and it will die if you breathe the breath. It's black and scaly looking. So they called it a black dragon. And the book on antimony is subtitled "My Dance with the Black Dragon."
I love it.
Because it's my story of how I got involved with antimony, really, and where it took me. So it was my dance with the dragon.
Alrighty. Well, I appreciate you, and thank you again. And have a great night.
Thanks. I appreciate it.